My granddad used to come to my room at night wearing a mask. Now I know why. Granddad's nighttime visits started when I was 13 years old. This was a few years ago now, but it only stopped fairly recently, and I still remember the first time it happened. It was the middle of the school holidays, and my mom was ill. Mom being ill wasn't something that bothered me too much at the time. It was a pretty common occurrence, something I was even used to by then. Every month it would happen the same way. Dad would come to my room and tell me Mom wasn't feeling so good, and that she'd have to go away for a while until she felt better. Then he'd drive off with her in his car, and collect her a few days later. I never knew where she went. Never knew what was wrong with her either. Sometimes she'd come home with scratches up her arms, but apart from that I never saw any other symptoms. When Dad went off to collect her, I'd wait by the door for them to come back. I'd wait for her to reappear and scoop me up into her arms. "I missed you, Cubby," she'd always say, planting kisses over my face. "I love you so much. My name's James, but as long as I can remember Mom's called me Cubby. It's her nickname for me." Every month, the same routine. Mom getting ill, going away for a bit, then coming back as if nothing was wrong. But the summer I turned 13, things changed. The routine changed. Because that was the first time I started going to stay at Granddad's. My granddad's a large man with a white beard and a shaved head. He's from Sheffield originally, and he still has this deep, gruff northern accent. Communicates mainly in grunts. Lives on his own on the edge of the New Forest, in an old ramshackle cottage. We hardly ever saw him when I was little, and when we did I always dreaded the visits. He scared me. I wasn't scared of him by the time I was 13, though. Or at least that's what I told myself. No, the reason I protested when Dad told me I'd be staying with Granddad this time while Mom got better was because I didn't want to leave the house. I wanted to stay near my friends. The kids I knew in the village would be out climbing trees and going on bike rides. If I was cooped up in Granddad's cottage I'd be missing out. Dad was having none of it, though. He wouldn't give me a reason why I had to go, or respond to my protests. Just told me it would be good for me to spend time with Granddad. Then he bundled me into the car and we left. 45 minutes later I was standing on the doorstep of Granddad's cottage, raising my hand to knock. Dad had already driven off. I was trying to tell myself I wasn't a little kid anymore, and there was nothing to be scared of. But as the cottage door creaked open and Granddad's large shadow fell over me, I couldn't stop my heart from beating a little harder in chest. Granddad's cottage was old. The ceilings were low and the furniture was minimal. The carpets were moth-eaten, ancient things that seemed to kick up tiny clouds of dust whenever you put a foot on them. The bathroom had black mold rising up the wallpaper. The paper itself was damp and flaking, and had peeled away to the stone in some areas. Entering the room felt like stepping into a cave. My bedroom wasn't much better. It was right at the back of the house, and it had only 3 pieces of furniture, an oak chest of drawers, a dilapidated wardrobe, and a single bed in the corner. I remember my heart sinking the minute I set eyes on it. Oddly, even though I can picture Granddad's house clearly enough, I don't remember much about how I spent my days there. Especially during that first visit. I think we mainly kept out of each other's way. Granddad would be in the lounge watching TV or reading, and I'd be in my room on my phone, making the most of the 1 bar of 4G I could find in the cottage. I can't remember if we spoke to each other much, or what we said if we did. Mostly it's a blur. What I do remember are the nights. The first night in particular. I told Granddad I was tired, and that I was going to head to bed early. He grunted something in response. Then I spent a bit of time in my room on Snap and YT, the videos taking painfully long to load, before heading to sleep. I woke sometime in the night. The cottage was silent around me. I could hear the leaves of the birch tree rustling in the wind in the back garden, but that was all. Moonlight spilled through a gap in the curtains. I leaned over to check my phone and saw that the time was a little after 2 a.m. For some reason I felt wide awake. My heart was beating hard in my chest and a film of sweat coated my forehead. As if I'd woken suddenly from a nightmare. But if I had, I couldn't remember it. I tried to relax, tried to lie back and let sleep wash over me again. But in Granddad's cottage, relaxing wasn't an easy thing to do. At first I'd only been able to hear the tree outside the window, but as I lay there on the pillow, staring into the darkness, I began to hear other noises, too. The soft creak of a floorboard, faint taps, a distant rattling, which I assumed had to be pipes in the wall, and other sounds, as well. Sounds I found it harder to place. At one point I heard something that sounded like a faint snuffling noise, coming from the back garden, some kind of animal. But when I sat up in bed and strained my ears, all I could hear was the wind. Get a effing grip, I told myself. You're 13 years old, not a little kid anymore. It was easier said than done, but I managed it eventually. I don't know how long I lay in the dark for, but after a while tiredness finally got the better of me. My mind began to settle. I felt myself slowly drifting off, only to jerk suddenly awake again when I heard a noise outside my room. A soft, deliberate creak. Loud and clear in the darkness. I turned over in bed, trying not to make a sound. My heart hammered in my chest. I pulled the covers down from my face slightly, positioning myself so I could peek over them. So I could see the bedroom door, and as I stared at it, feeling like I was 5 years old again, I saw the handle begin to turn. I squinted my eyes shut. I don't know what thought was going through my mind, but right then I reverted to an age-old tactic, pretending to be asleep. playing dead. I could still see through a crack in my eyelids, but now the room was blurry as well as dark. I lay as still as possible, trying to keep my breathing normal. For a few seconds, nothing happened. There were no more sounds, and then, just as I was beginning to think I might have imagined it after all, the door swung inwards. Granddad stood in the frame. I couldn't make out his face, but I recognized his towering bulk. He was standing completely still, filling the doorway top to bottom, breathing heavily in the silence. "He's just checking on you," I told myself. "He's come to check that you're okay, that's all." But even as the thought went through my head, I saw something that made my blood turn cold. I saw something that made me suck in a sharp breath and tense my entire body below the covers. The shape of Granddad's head was wrong. It was all wrong. Even in the blurry shadows, the wrongness was unmistakable. His silhouette bulged out in strange places, bulking out around the lower half of his face in a way I couldn't understand. I opened my eyes another fraction of an inch, unable to help myself, and what I saw did nothing to quiet the fierce whirling in my chest. Granddad was wearing a mask, a black mask. It covered the lower half of his face, allowing space at the top for his eyes to peer over at me. The mask covered his mouth and nose, with multiple straps on each side stretching around his cheeks to the back of his head. It looked like one of those pollution masks people sometimes wore in big cities. I snapped my eyes fully shut, forced myself to breathe in, then out, then in again, nice and slow. I kept my ears strained for the sound of Granddad's feet on my bedroom floor, but it never came. After a while later I heard the soft squeak of the door shutting, and his footsteps receding down the hall. We never spoke about him coming into my room. I never mentioned it to Granddad, and he never said anything about it to me. I never told anyone else, either. I thought about telling Mom or Dad after that first visit, but in the end I kept quiet. Partly because I was so happy to be home again, I think, but mostly because the memory had taken on a strange quality by that point. It was like an old, half-forgotten nightmare. I could still picture it, but the fear I'd felt at the time had faded. It was as though the whole thing had happened to someone else. The feeling didn't last, though. Next month Mom got ill again and I was packed back off to Granddad's cottage. I protested hard at that time, but Dad still wouldn't bend. He just told me to stop being selfish and to give my mom some space so she could get better. Wouldn't look at me as he said it. And once again, when I stayed at Granddad's cottage, he came to my room, stood in the shadows of the doorway, the same black mask on his face. He never touched me or anything. I don't want you to think that. This isn't that kind of story. He simply stood on the threshold of my room, on the edge of the moonlight, staring in at me. Then after a while, he'd leave again. The ritual happened every time I visited. It's been happening each month for the past 3 years. And it was only yesterday that I finally learned the truth. Only yesterday when all the pieces clicked into place at last. My 16th birthday, I began to get ill, weak and tired, with no energy, hungry all the time. I got this prickly rash on my body, too, and my muscles and bones constantly seemed to ache. It was summer, so there was no school, and I stayed in bed all day, falling in and out of a broken sleep, dreaming. The dreams were vivid and strange. In them it was nighttime, and I was running, sprinting through the woods as fast as I could. Faster than I'd ever gone before in my life. The moon hung overhead in a purple-black sky, framing me like a spotlight. And at the end of each dream, I'd stumble out into a clearing. I'd see Granddad's cottage. And just as his front door began to creak open, I'd wake up in a cold sweat. Yesterday evening, Dad visited me in my room, came and sat beside my bed. He told me that Mom was ill, too, and that he'd have to take her away for a few days. Told me to get lots of rest. But when I asked him what time he'd be coming home, he told me he wouldn't. Not for a few days, anyway. He said he'd be back when Mom was better, and in the meantime Granddad was going to come round and look after me. That was when I finally lost it. I was too ill to get properly angry at him, but I did my best, screamed and yelled, told him I didn't effing want Granddad to come and stay with me. I wanted him and Mom, accused him of abandoning me, said I hated him. He just sat on the chair beside my bed and took it, listened to me without saying anything. The guy looked more tired and old in that moment than I'd ever seen him look before in my life. And when I was finally finished, when my throat was so raw I couldn't yell anymore, he said something to me. Something that started a conversation I'll never forget. "I know you don't understand why I'm doing this right now, but you will soon. Granddad will explain everything." I sighed and lay back against my pillow, exhausted. "I don't effing want Granddad to explain anything, Dad. I want you here." "I know you do, James, but I can't stay here. Not right now. It's not safe for me." I opened my eyes fully and stared at him, suddenly alarmed. "What do you mean it's not safe? Am I contagious or something?" No. He shook his head. "It's nothing like that. It's just that at certain times of the month, I have to." He sighed again and looked back down at me, shook his head once more. "It really is best if your grandfather explains all this, James. Your mother can help, too, when she's back. I might know more about it than most, but I don't really know, not like them." I had the urge, almost overwhelming, to reach out and shake him. I didn't understand anything he was saying. "What do they need to explain?" I said. "Can you please just tell me what the F's going on?" My dad sighed again. He stood up and walked over to my bedroom window, then peered out through the curtains. "Big moon up there tonight," he said after a moment. "Not even dark out and I can already see it." He stared through the glass for a while, then turned back again. Turned to face me. "James, you know how your mom gets poorly each month?" he said. "How she has to go away for a while until she's better." I nodded. Of course I knew. "Okay, well, the reason she has to go away is because she has this rare condition. It only flares up every once in a while, and it's easy enough to predict when it's going to happen. But that's the only thing about it you can predict. At her age, they can get. Well, your mother finds it hard to do certain things, I suppose. She finds it hard to act in a certain way." "What condition does she have?" "Your granddad will explain that better than me." "Why will he explain?" "Why can't you just effing tell me?" "Because he has it, too." "I don't understand why you can't." I paused, suddenly processing what my dad had just said. "Wait, did you say granddad has it?" Dad nodded. After a moment he sat down on the end of my bed, ran a hand through his hair. "It's genetic, James. Granddad has it, and your mom has it. And you have it as well." I stared at him, unsure I'd heard him correctly. I have. "Yes, you do. It's not a bad condition, exactly, but it's something that has to be managed carefully. Your granddad has lived with it for a long time, and he knows all about it. He'll be able to help you." Blood was pounding in my ears. Thoughts and memories were suddenly pressing at the edges of my mind like angry dogs. I pushed them away and focused on Dad. "Is that why you started sending me to his house every month?" "So I got to know him better? So he could effing help me with whatever the F this is I've got?" Dad stared at me with sadness in his eyes. "It wasn't my idea," he said after a moment. "Your mother said it was best." Grandad agreed with her. "When you're coming of age, it's good if you can spend time with older ones of there. Well, like I said, your granddad can explain it." I bit back another urge to scream at him. I still didn't really understand what the hell he was talking about, or at least, the main part of my mind didn't understand. At the same time, though, something was starting to nag at me. Images and memories circled the outskirts of my brain. Just out of sight. Monsters around a campfire. I swallowed. "You said it wasn't safe for you," I said after a moment. "When Mom gets ill, you said you can't be around her." Dad paused, then nodded his head. "And what about Granddad? Are you safe around him?" Dad opened his mouth, then closed it again. He frowned. "Your grandfather's better at dealing with his symptoms," he said eventually. "He's had longer to get used to them than your mother has. But, no, I still wouldn't be safe." "Not completely." "So why was I safe?" I exploded. "Why did you ship me off to stay with him every month? Is that why I've caught this effing thing?" No, I told you, it's genetic. You were born with it, and besides, your grandfather would never hurt you. We took extra precautions on the worst nights, too." I insisted on it. "We made sure you'd never." But my dad's voice was suddenly growing distant. The things circling my mind had grown close enough for me to see them at last. They came out of the shadows and were lit up by the flames. Exposed. A barrage of images and memories flew through my head in a blur. I remembered the times Mom had come home with scratches up her arms. I remembered the dream I'd had where I was running through the woods. I remembered Granddad, standing in my bedroom doorway in the cottage, the black mask covering his face. And in that moment, I realized something I'd never understood before. Something that filled me with a sickening combination of terror and excitement. The thing on Granddad's face hadn't been a mask after all. It was a muzzle.